But we got into this mess today, I believe, because for 100 years, long time before any of us were in charge, we drifted away from the precise understanding or desire to follow the Constitution. Whether it was the war issue, the monetary issue, the entitlement system, the principle of the republic versus pure democracy, we have slipped a long way from this. The founders were very clear about what their understanding what a republic was all about. It was representative government, it was local government, it was the principles of liberty, and above all, it was to protect the minority. And they warned against slipping into pure democracy. Pure democracy is when rights become relative, when 51% can dominate the minority. So what we really want is a system that protects minorities, minority opinion, and the minority that is most abused in this country today is the individual.
That's right.
So rights come to us not from our government. Our rights come from our Creator in a natural way. Our liberties come in the same manner. Unfortunately, the consequence of that understanding should be that if you have your right to your life and the right to your liberty, you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of your labor.
That's right.
But in the last 100 years or so, we have come around to thinking about rights as not as individuals, but as in groups. And this was, in a way, a natural consequence of punishing some groups in our early history. Certain groups of people, minorities, were punished and discriminated against. And then people thought, well, now we have to reverse that and give special privileges to minority groups and hyphenated Americans. So we still see ourselves so often as hyphenated Americans. I at times sort of resent the election because they always put everybody into a block. How did the Hispanics vote? How did the white people vote? How did the minorities vote? Why don't we ask, how did the Americans vote? That's what we really want to know. So when we have a return of our republic and return of an understanding of liberty, we will think of ourselves as individuals. And this is, to me, a wonderful thing because this brings people together. We defend the system because we all agree on liberty, but we're unconcerned about how we use our liberty. We should protect everybody's right to their life and their liberty. You can use your life in a productive way or in a destructive way as long as you assume responsibility and as long as you get the rewards, that you can use your life as you choose. And the same way, you ought to be able to use your money as you choose. And get to spend your economic money as well, you know. But we have drifted from that we don't have trust in the people and understanding. I think many people fear liberty, and they fear that you won't spend your money right. I've had members of Congress tell me when they were voting on a law that was telling you what to do with your personal life, well, people are too dumb. They have to have politicians tell them what to do. But let me give you a hint of what's really going on in Washington. I know a few of those people up there. I know some politicians, I know some bureaucrats, and they're not smart enough to tell you what to do with your life or your money. They don't know what is best for you, and if they make a mistake, which they on occasion do, they make it for all of us. If you make a mistake, if you have your liberty back and you make a mistake, you suffer the consequences. And there'll be other. It's not like saying nothing would happen. It would mean that the government can't come in if you've done harm to yourself and it was your responsibility. Yes, you can get help from family, friends, neighbors, churches, or whatever. But to devise a whole system that says that if you get into trouble, you have to go to the government to spend money on this, buy this, do this. When people come to me and they say, I want the government to take care of this problem. I said, well, who's the government? Where's the government going to get their money? The only money the government has is the money they steal from people. And they do that in a seductive manner. They do it seductively because sometimes it's through direct taxation, and that's pretty obvious. If we had to pay our taxes on a monthly basis individually for all the government we get, this whole system would quit because everybody would know, hey, we're not getting our money's worth. So they don't do that. They get as much as they can, then they destroy the economy, and because of the weak economy, the revenues go down. So they have to have another source of revenue, and that's borrowing money, something Jefferson tried to prevent, but we borrowed to the hilt, you know. young people like you're inheriting a debt of $16 trillion. That's a small amount to be concerned about. Students now are graduating with a debt. The total debt for the student loans now is over $1 trillion. It's loaded down with debt. But even that's not enough to pay for big government. The appetite for this huge government to do things they shouldn't be doing. Where do they get the rest of the money? They print it. They print the money, and that is the source of so much trouble. It's the source of the business cycle. It's price fixing. It's fixing the value and the price of money. It distorts allocation of credit, and the credit allocation becomes dominated by members of Congress and what Congress does, but also secretly by the Federal Reserve. And they make plenty of mistakes. They created the crisis, and then they made it worse by giving the bailouts to the very people who were ripping us off from the bubble that they were involved in. Right now, I've been talking a lot about how your obligations are going to grow because actually Europe's in a little worse shape than we are financially. But the whole world is in trouble financially because it's the biggest financial bubble in the history of the world. And it's all based on the fiat dollar. Because it's a dollar-denominated world currency, we were able to issue the currency. It's sort of like being able to issue the gold. So all the other currencies use the dollar as the base. And therefore, they have inflated in a distorted thing. And a typical example to understand that is what's happening in Greece. We're in the middle of that mess over there. And I've always said, and I continue to be convinced it's happening, that is, you will get the burden of bailing out Europe. And that is the reason that we have to know exactly what the Federal Reserve is doing, get control of the Federal Reserve, have an audit of the Federal Reserve, and find out who they're bailing out. And the reason they will be bailed out is because the establishments have too much at stake. It's the Goldman Sachs and the banks of the world and the big corporations, the military-industrial complex. They all have a lot at stake. So they got a lot of bailouts in 07 and 08 and 09, but a lot of it occurred in the open, but a lot occurred secretly. The Federal Reserve was involved with $15 trillion of churning of new credit when the crisis hit. Over half of it went to foreign central banks and foreign governments. They deserve nothing. That money should have been left here. It shouldn't have been inflation because you're suffering from the consequence of the inflation. Now, they also secretly finance things through international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. Two organizations that I'll tell you what, if you're interested in individual liberty, you don't need the United Nations or the IMF protecting your liberties because they don't do it. Today it was just announced that the IMF would spend another $38 billion bailing out Greece and the other banks. And we pay the most into the IMF, and it's to the extent of over $20 billion we have given to countries like Greece and Ireland and other countries like this. And there's a number, I think they paid per capita 17 times more per capita to the people of Greece than they did to all the per capita of the bailouts in this country. So the bailouts are going to the internationalists. It's not going to the people of this country. You're getting the burden. The middle class losing their jobs. The middle class are losing their houses. And this is the reason that we have to look into the monetary system, because it's through the Federal Reserve that the special interests get their protection. In 1913, of course, we had the introduction of the income tax. That guaranteed the ushering in of big government, and the income tax was supposed to be very small on a few rich people. Well, guess what? It's been here a long time. It's very complex. Nobody understands it. The economy is weak, and actually it's generating less revenues at this moment than they had hoped for. But the income tax is based on the assumption that the government owns all your money. All your income is owned by the government, and they will permit you to keep a certain percentage according to their rules. So the founders didn't invent that. This is ushered in the 20th century when our country embarked on big government. So this invited and introduced the notion of the entitlement system. An entitlement system that is based on the principle that the dictatorship of the majority can undermine the rights of the minority. And this has helped significantly to bankrupt our country. So the entitlement welfare system blossomed in these last 100 years, but something else happened once we had this taxing program, borrowing, and also the inflation. It encouraged those, especially since World War I time, Woodrow Wilson period, that we had some type of a moral obligation to not only make the world safe for democracy, but to promote our so-called goodness, even if it took force and occupation and wars. By golly, we're going to force it on all foreign countries. My suggestion is that philosophy is wrong, occupation of other countries is wrong, nation building is wrong, and we ought to just come home. Most important thing when we're dealing with these expenditures overseas is to distinguish between the Defense Department and defending our country versus military spending. We spend more money than everybody else put together. We have more weapons than everybody else put together. Who's going to invade us? Who's going to lob a bomb on us? Nobody's going to do that. It's going to be some other way. Our greatest threat today, worldwide and in this country, is a financial collapse. And that is the reason we have to understand that debt is bad. It's a debt system. The monetary system is based on debt. The whole entitlement system and foreign policy is based on debt. So this is the reason. My suggestion is that in the very first year, to make that point, we ought to cut spending in real terms by $1 trillion. And this could be done, of course, by changing our foreign policy. Why do we still have troops in Korea? Why do we have troops in Germany? That subsidizes their countries, not our country. Why are we in these endless wars? And the truth is, they're planning on more wars. And we can't even keep up with them. We don't know how many countries we're in, but I think we have about 900 bases in 138 countries around the world. And right now the plan is they're just itching. The other candidates say, when are we going to go get into Syria? Why don't we start dropping bombs on Syria? When are we going to hit Iran? I mean, it's on and on. I'll tell you what, the Republicans are going to be in big trouble unless they come our way and decide they want a president who's more for peace than for war is what they need. Not only is it the correct moral position, not only is it the correct constitutional position, not only is it the correct economic position, it is the only position that we can have to bring peace to the world. This whole idea, and it makes political sense too. Yes, there's a lot of people in the Republican primary that give me a lot of grief saying, well, you're not willing to bomb these countries, you're not willing to invade these countries, why aren't you more militaristic? Of course, I'm the only one that served any time in the military. And of course, those people who are anxious to criticize don't say too much about our campaign getting the most money, 7 times more money than the rest of them put together. We get the money from the military. So it is necessary to change this whole concept of foreign policy. That we do need to spread our goodness, but we need to decide what is our goodness. Is our goodness our ability to invade countries and occupy countries and tell them how to live? Or should our goodness be found in defending civil liberties here, having a sound currency, having a prosperous economy, making friends and trade with people, and trying to reconcile the problems in the world? If that is the case, why don't we do that, set an example? Maybe somebody would want to follow us and emulate what we do. when I was called to military duty in 1962 during the Cuban crisis, and then was in for 5 years, and that was during the Vietnam crisis. Vietnam turned out to be a tragedy. We lost 60,000 military personnel during that time, and we lost. We came home. And the statement was, we had to be there. We had to stay because we can't lose our war. The mission is to win and stop the spread of communism. Well, we lost, and guess what? Vietnam and China, they ended up becoming more westernized when we left them alone. And now we trade with Vietnam, we talk to them, we go back and forth, we invest over there. Just think what was achieved in peace that wasn't achieved of 20 years of the French and Americans trying to tell the Vietnamese what they ought to do with their country. Today, one of the most common questions I'm asked on the campaign trail is having to do with very important events going on in Afghanistan. What would I do about Afghanistan? Of course, I think most people know what I would have done a long time ago. I wouldn't have been in there. I wouldn't have been occupying Afghanistan. Their argument is, isn't that where Al-Qaeda came from? Don't we have to, I heard somebody state today, another candidate, and said, oh, well, we have to stay there until we can assure that the Al-Qaeda will never return to Afghanistan, because that's where Al-Qaeda came from. Al-Qaeda passed through Afghanistan, that is true, but it was also financed in Saudi Arabia. 15 out of 19 were Saudis. They also passed through Germany. They also passed through Spain, and they also passed through Florida and got their flying training in Florida. So this idea that we have to stay forever in Afghanistan in hopes that the Al-Qaeda doesn't come back. Well, Al-Qaeda, which is in a way a more militant group of people than the Taliban, well, during the occupation by the Soviets, we allied ourselves with those same very people. We were on the side of bin Laden when the Soviets were involved. So this whole idea that we have to stay there and reform them. Guess what motivates the Taliban? One thing. Get rid of foreign occupiers. I would say to reduce the threat, why don't we just take good advice and leave Afghanistan? But it is true, and some of the other candidates are starting to talk differently. And even our president's starting to talk differently. Oh yeah, we will leave in a year or two. But tell you what, they haven't changed their policy. It's all talk right now. We supposedly have left Iraq, but we still have the biggest base, the biggest embassy in the world. We've spent $1 billion building it. We just had an appropriation of $5 billion to maintain 17,000 people in an embassy in Baghdad, and they say we're leaving. We still have military bases all around that region. And if they're worried about Al-Qaeda, we need to change our foreign policy. We went into Iraq to get Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda wasn't there. Guess what? Al-Qaeda is there now. The Christians have been run out and the Al-Qaeda has come back in. So the policy makes no sense. Now, of course, everybody's worried about Syria. What are we going to do about Syria? Guess what? The Al-Qaeda is very much involved. Guess where they're coming from? Al-Qaeda's coming from Iraq and getting involved in the Syria skirmish. And our policy in Egypt has totally backfired on us and on Israel, because we propped up Mubarak for all these years. They loved our money, helped contribute to these massive debt you're inheriting. So the people finally rebel against their dictatorship. And guess what? The government of Egypt now is not friendly with Israel. And Al-Qaeda is there. So the unintended consequences and the expense of all this makes no sense whatsoever. This is the reason the founders gave us wise advice to stay out of these entangling alliances, stay out of the internal affairs of other people, trade with people, talk to people, but don't try to tell other people how they're supposed to run their country. Of course, that same principle should be applied to us domestically. Why should the government tell you what you should do with your personal life? And they want to do it all the time. They're fearful. They're fearful that somebody might use their personal prerogatives in a way that they won't endorse. And that is true. Some individuals may do some things that I wouldn't approve of and you might not approve of. But does that mean you have the authority to try to mold people? Or are we going to take that very risky adventure and allow people to make up their own minds on what they want to do with their own lives and their own money?
Yeah.
Some claim that we should be involved economically because there will be unfair distribution of wealth. It won't be equal, but guess what happens in a society that's free? The freer the society, history has proven, the more prosperous the society. And the larger the middle class. But what's happening today? Debasement of currency and government intervention and the special interests, the money gravitates from the middle class to the wealthy. Exactly what's been happening for 30 or 40 years and magnified with the bailouts. So Wall Street, the Goldman Sachs of the world and the banks and the military-industrial complex, they don't come up short, but the middle class does. Our middle class is shrinking. Jobs are tough. The debt burden is on the people, and the bailouts continue. There's one deeply flawed assumption made by the opposition. They believe that debt is good and that if you're not spending your money, they want you to spend more money. But what if you're maxed out and what if you don't have a job? How can you spend more money? Oh, they have an answer. The government has to spend the money. But where are they going to get the money? They can't squeeze it out of the people anymore, but they're going to print the money. The fallacy there is the government, it seems like, well, if they print the money and distribute it, wouldn't this help? But do they distribute the money to the people? Did they go and bail out the mortgage holders? No, they went and bailed out the banks. And this is what we're doing through the IMF and the world, and what the Fed does overseas. They bail out the banks and the people who did the derivatives. And the middle class now, because we are less free and we don't have a sound currency, the middle class now is shrinking and it's getting poorer. And if I had to make a choice on whether I wanted to live in a totally free society and be poorer, I would want to live in a totally free society. That's probably my personal choice. But we never have to make that choice. If you decide that you want to live in a free society and protect property rights and contract rights and sound money and limited government, guess what? That's where the greatest prosperity comes from. So if we are truly humanitarians and we care about our fellow man, I don't know how you could give up on the principles and the cause of liberty and private property rights. That's where prosperity comes from. But of course today we're concerned about the materialism of society. And I think this happened a long time before most of us here were born. You know, in the early part of the last century, we concentrated more on the materialism of what is produced. And therefore we used the government to play favorites, redistribute wealth, help one group or another. And for decades they were able to get away with it because the production was so great and there was so much prosperity that they were able to get away with this mischief. But it's different now. What you're coming into is an age where that system has ended because we are no longer the wealthiest country. We're the biggest debtor nation, not in the world, but in the world history. We owe more money to foreigners, and that means we have an obligation to pay that. That means because we have lived beyond our means for many decades, unless we change our ways, we will live beneath our means for a long time to come. That is what is necessary to address the principles of liberty, address the Constitution, address monetary policy, address the issue of foreign policy, address the issue of entitlements, address the issue of personal liberty. If we do that, the solution is not that difficult. And they say, well, if you do that, there's going to be some bad times. It would be really rough. When this make conditions worse? In a way, that's true. But guess who it would be worse for? It would be the people who've been ripping us off. They're the ones that would get a bad deal of it. But if I were able to achieve my goals and have a wand that I could wave, and I could return to you the incentive system, the right to your life, the right to your liberty, bring our troops home, work for peace around the world, and say that you don't have any income tax, and the burden of regulations, especially written unconstitutionally by bureaucrats in Washington or executive orders by the president, wave a wand and get rid of all those laws and say that you can keep your fruits of your labor. Would you think that is a sacrifice, or would you think that is a benefit? January 1st of this year, 40,000 new laws came into effect. Nobody can keep up. I'd like to be the first president that got rid of 40,000 laws in 1 month. That's what I would like to do. And of course, I'm one president. I can guarantee you that I wouldn't go to war without a declaration. I would not go to war that way. Now the Constitution is flaunted. Our administration says that they can go to war. You know, seriously, Panetta gets there and says, well, I don't need to talk to Congress. We'll inform you after we do it, but we don't have to talk to you. That means he doesn't need to talk to you through your congressman to declare and decide when we go to war. That's 100% opposite of what the founders wanted. And he said, well, I'll get my authority. And the senator asked, where are you going to get this authority? Well, we'll get the authority from the United Nations or from NATO. And of course, that is absolutely unconstitutional. Actually, it's illegal under even the treaty. Because when we signed on NATO and the United Nations, at least there were a few people there back then that were a little bit worried about them taking away our sovereign right to declare war. In those treaties, it says this does not usurp the power of the Congress to have the final decision about war. It'd be better not even to be in those organizations, but we're in them. We still have the law on our sides, we have morality on our side, and we have the Constitution on our side. We should never go to war unless the Congress declares it. Then we can go fight these wars and win them and get them over with. But one of the things that these constant war generates is our carelessness when we look at our liberties, because they say, well, this is special conditions. We're in war, so you have to give up some of your liberties. And they talked about after 9/11, they say, well, you have to give up your liberties to be safe. I've concluded, in my own personal mind, is that it is never necessary to give up any liberties to be safe and secure. Never. And of course, we were advised that if we ever embarked on that course of giving up liberties for our safety, we'll end up with neither, and I'm afraid we're approaching that. We do not have our liberties. They're being constantly undermined. Our liberties are being undermined, and as far as the threat from a terrorist, it still exists because of the foreign policy and aggravating people and just pestering people. So we're not safer, not more secure, and individually speaking, we're unsafe. But today, it isn't like we have World War II and we have to compromise our liberties and we put the Japanese Americans in prison camps and then we release them and we sort of backtrack a little bit. Today, it has been decided that we're in perpetual war around the world because anybody who looks like they might be a terrorist, we are going to fight and involve and invade countries forever and ever. So therefore, your civil liberty is going to be under attack forever and ever unless we reverse this whole mentality of what our foreign policy is talking about. So the president tells us he can declare war when he wants under the United Nations, but he also tells us that he now has the legal authority to assassinate American citizens. Somebody asked him about what about the rule of law. He says, oh, we'll discuss it among our little group. That'll be the rule of law. And they said, well, what about the Constitution? He said, oh, it's constitutional. He said, I'm the commander-in-chief. And anything that is not prohibited in the Constitution, I, as a president, am allowed to do. That is a gross distortion of the Constitution. The president, and as your president, I would follow this. As president, presidents can only do those things that they're explicitly permitted to do. And of course, that applies to the Congress and the courts as well, and we have drifted so far from that. that those things that were not explicitly given to the federal government were to be maintained by the people and the states. And that is, unfortunately, there's not much left of that today because we have massive surveillance ever since 9/11. Quickly after 9/11, they passed a law they had been trying to pass for years. But within days, they passed the ill-founded and ill-named Patriot Act. I'm convinced that the Patriot Act would not have been passed if they'd have been more honest with us. If they would have called it to repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe somebody would have voted against it. But it is the Patriot Act and that mentality that gives you all that wonderful protection that I know you enjoy if you ever have to get on an airplane. You know the TSA there, your friends will take care of you, x-ray you and prod you and poke at you, and then decide, well, you don't look too dangerous, we'll let you go on an airplane. No privacy is left in this country today. Your medical privacy is gone, your financial privacy is gone, and now they don't need search warrants at all to search what we do. The founders would be aghast at what we have given up. And, so it does need a reawakening. We don't have to reinvent anything. We need to improve on what we have, but we need people of character that will stand up to this abuse. But the politicians in Washington will come your way if you agree with this, if you let their voices be heard. Believe me, in Washington, I think we need some ear, nose, and throat doctors. We need to check their ears because they don't listen. They're not hearing you. But on a rare occasion, they do. What about when the message got out to many of people like you who heard about a Stop Online Piracy Act? That message was heard. They withdrew the bills from the House and the Senate because they knew the American people that was one step too far. But we allow these other things to go along and they creep along and it gets more difficult. So the system still can work, but we have to get it out, whether it's dealing with a piece of legislation or whether it's dealing with an election that's coming up. A message ought to be sent that the status quo should not be tolerated and we need some real changes in this country. You know, the Congress hasn't helped us much at all. I mean, the president takes some of these prerogatives on his own, but the Congress could stop the wars. They could just defund the wars and they'd have to come home. They don't do it. But what about the bill that they passed last December and sent it to the president? He signed it on January 1st as well, and that's the National Defense Authorization Act. Here's a bill that repeals posse comitatus. It says the military, for the first time in our history, can arrest any American citizens for infractions for civil laws. And the worst part about it, it says that it can hold an American citizen indefinitely in a secret prison without a trial, without an attorney. That is not part of the America that I have come to understand. I don't believe we'll survive unless we deal with this whole concept of assassinations and Patriot Act and arresting people by a U.S. military and no trials, repeal of habeas corpus, essentially that. We are known now more for a country that promotes assassinations and invasions and occupation. But what about this whole principle that's been around for about 10 years now? And it's shared. Unfortunately, they talk about more bipartisanship, but I see the bipartisanship doing the wrong things too often. I mean, it's been bipartisan support of the Federal Reserve that is our problem. But on foreign policy, you get a lot of bipartisan support. And there's bipartisan support for this concept of preemptive war. That's a fancy term for starting the war. That's a fancy term for aggression. We're to defend our country, but to start the wars because somebody might get a weapon someday, it makes no sense whatsoever. You know, statistically, I'll bet you could find, and I've seen stories about this, the large majority, if not almost everybody in Iran, does not want to have a war. You know, they don't want to be attacked and they don't want to be bombed. I'll bet you their leaders don't even want to. But there's tough political talk. Then there's tough political talk on our side why we have to go over there. But do the people want the war? No, the people don't want the war. It's the governments that want the wars. And this is the reason that we have to speak out. And unfortunately, if things don't change, it will end. The foreign policy will end, but it's going to end in real tragedy because this country will be bankrupt and we won't be able to form. That's how great nations usually are brought down. That's how the Soviet system was brought down. Fortunately, we didn't have to fight a nuclear war with the Soviets, but that system came down mainly because of the bankruptcy. And we're truly on the verge of that because the spending is endless. But the attack on our liberties are endless too. You take another war that's been going on since the early 1970s. We spent between $3 and $4 trillion on an ill-advised war, one that it permits our government to invade thousands and thousands of our homes looking for people who might be using illegal substances. The war on drugs should be declared a loss, a failure, hasn't done any good, and we should abandon it. I don't know why those on the more liberal side and more conservative side shouldn't come together on this issue, because conservatives a lot of time talk about states' rights, and that's supposed to be a bad term now, politically incorrect to say states' rights, but that's what the Constitution says. The rights and the privileges are reserved for the states and to the people. But what about an issue like marijuana, the benign offering of states to vote on marijuana for medicinal purposes? They have that. Why couldn't the left and the right come together and say the states should have a right to allow sick people to use marijuana? You know, I personally abhor the use of so many of the drugs but I see it as a physician and somebody involved in politics as more of a sickness than a crime. Why should an individual who has been caught 3 times using drugs, never committed a violent act, be put in prison for life? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. I think we'll win that argument because common sense eventually sinks in, even if it takes 30 or 40 or 50 years. Slow learners over there in Washington, I guess. So the drug addiction, it should be treated more as addiction. Every time we come across an alcoholic, if he hasn't committed a violent act, we treat him as somebody that needs some help. But if you've been using drugs and they happen to be illegal according to the government, you can get put in prison for so long and really turned into a criminal. So it makes a lot more sense to me to deal with it in a completely different fashion. And besides, if you're really concerned about addiction and all these problems, why don't we look at what prescription drugs do? You know, look at all the problems with prescription drugs. You know, though there was this time in history where rights were designated and people were excluded because of certain groups, and fortunately we've drifted away from there, there's still, in the area of the drug prosecution, I think it's still very biased. If you happen to be poor, and you happen to be a minority, and you happen to have used drugs, and you can't afford a rich attorney, what are the odds of you going to prison versus the fact if you're a rich white person, how often will you go to prison for life for the use of drugs? I think there's too much bias in the judicial system today. No, I think what we should be doing is being more concerned on productivity. But we are at odds. The parties seem to be at odds, but philosophically, the parties aren't at odds with each other. They support the same position. Foreign policy. George Bush ran on no nation building and no policeman of the world. And look at what happened. Obama was the peace candidate, verified by the fact he won the Nobel Peace Prize, you know. So the peace candidate, so often does win. But we need to make the decision, though, on whether or not this will continue. And I think the decisions are very, very obvious. But when it comes to this whole issue of liberty bringing us together, whether it's a foreign policy or monetary policy, we did, I think, a pretty good job on getting this issue. For the first time in the history of the Federal Reserve, we got Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives to understand the need to check in and find out what the Federal Reserve has been doing on a thorough audit. But I'm optimistic enough to believe that we can bring people together on the big issue of liberty. Why individuals who call themselves liberals, and why the issue of liberty as understood by conservatives, why we shouldn't come together. Whether it's audit the Fed, hopefully we can persuade more about the wars, the fact that the other candidates are now saying, hey, you know, maybe it is a good idea we come home from Afghanistan. So there is a shift. We should be able to come together. We should be able to come together with deficits. I can't imagine those who like big government at home should endorse deficit when it leads to this crisis. But we should be able to come together not because of our lifestyles, not because of how we would use our liberty, not because how we would spend our money, but because we want our freedom. People should come together because we want to be free individuals. In a partial way, we still have remnants of that belief. We usually don't go out challenging people about their religious beliefs. Every once in a while, I think it has crept into this campaign a theocratic approach to politics, which I do not like. But we should be able to bring people together because we want you to make your choices on how you spend your money. But how you spend your money should be equivalent to how you spend your life, what your social values are. You know, this whole idea and the amount of time we've been spending, you know, the world's coming apart. The debt is exploding. The wars are going on. The financial crisis on our doorstep. And we're fighting over who's going to pay for the birth control pills. You know, that's beyond belief, you know, that becomes the biggest issue. Liberty has to become the issue. And a lot of people are frightened. They're fearful of liberty because individuals might practice a lifestyle they don't like and they will resent it. Well, that is one requirement in a free society. You have to become a little more tolerant than some people are. You need to tolerate other people. But if you're still not convinced, toleration doesn't mean endorsement. I tolerate to the best of my ability. I have personal feelings about what people should do. I have a right to take care of my own life and maybe advise my children and raise my children. But we don't have a right to try to tell other people. So you do become tolerant. But other people, if they're doing things you don't like, they don't have a right to force it on you. And that's what government's about. Government is power. And they want to force economic issues on us and economic redistribution, and they want to force lifestyles on us. They want to force the definition of marriage on us. They're always wanting to tell us what to do. There's a lot of busybody in Washington who like running a nanny state. I want to repeal the nanny state. We had the best trial of freedom in the history of the world. We were the freest and the most prosperous. Now we are not so free. The experiment is at crossroads. A lot of people say this is the election that will determine it. Now, I don't think November is going to determine it. It'll have a significance. If you keep voting for warmongers, yes, this is going to be very negative. But we are at a crossroads. We don't know when the final decision has to be made, but there will be one. We'll have to decide which way we're going, toward tyranny or toward liberty. Those who oppose us claim that we want to go backwards, backwards to the old days. But freedom is so young, there aren't very many old days, 100 years or 200 years. What about 6,000 years of history? Those who promote big government for whatever reason are tyrants, and they want to go back to the tyranny of the ages. We want something new and wonderful, freedom for the individual. So we don't want to give up on what we've had. It doesn't mean that we go back and are fixated 100 years ago, but we can pick up the pieces. The monetary system was imperfect in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. It was not a perfect one. There's better understanding now in economics on a better monetary system. So there's no reason why we can't pick up the pieces and move forward and have a better society. The Soviet system was up against many more odds. The Russians did not have the full understanding that we in our country have. We have a good history. We know something about our Constitution. We know about limited government, individual liberty, sound economic policy, and property rights and contract rights. We know something about that. So it isn't like we have to invent it out anew. But what we have to do is decide which way we're going to go. I know which way I want to go because I want to live in a free society. I don't want to be a participant in a government or a society that dictates through force an understanding of what liberty is and isn't by telling people what to do with their lives. That should be your choice. It should be the choice of other people around the world. And I am absolutely convinced if our goal should be peace and prosperity, this is the only way it can be achieved. You cannot achieve peace by war. Preventive war, initiating war, that is not the way you achieve peace. Now the problems seem at times overwhelming, and some people say, well, how are we ever going to get 51% of the people to endorse that? Actually, you don't have to. You just need a group like this that is energetic, understanding, studies the issues, and understand the issues. We need an energized minority, an irate, tireless minority who's willing to start these brush fires of liberty in the minds of men. That's what we need. Because we're literally getting thousands of people paying attention. Of course, the evening news, they haven't paid any attention yet, but thousands of people are now paying attention. So not only do I think there are many, many brush fires that have been going on for the past 30 years, I think it's approaching a forest fire of interest out of need now that we have something different, that we can't continue this spending, we can't continue these wars, we can't continue if we want to live in a free society. So I see magnificent things happening. I see it on the campuses. I go to so many campuses, and if it's truly a philosophic revolution, it has to come from the campuses. It has to be the young people, because the young people, when they become middle-aged and older, unless they belong to a remnant who remembers true liberty, they will fall the trap into becoming the part of the status quo. So all great revolutions and change of ideas come from young people, energetic, willing to stand up and fight for a cause. And for those that aren't in school and are not quite so young, you have to be young in spirit. And that is the only thing that counts. But we should be optimistic because the numbers are growing, and of course there are many who have been in a remnant. They've been frustrated, their independence, and they felt like they have been disenfranchised. They are very much interested in what we're talking about. So when it looks at some of the statistics and some of the votes, it's easy to become discouraged and say, oh, you know, the cause of liberty didn't do so well last night. But I'll tell you what, if you put the cause of liberty out on the table and let everybody vote where there's less control of the voting, let all the people vote, the independents vote, and let the Democrats vote, guess what? We do quite well, and many times we beat the rest of the candidates, and we can come out on top of Obama as well.